The first one I'm going to start with is Beneficial Use Permit Exemption Section, otherwise known as the BUD program. So this section of the rule allows a person beneficially using a solid waste to apply to ecology for a statewide exemption from permitting. So it's different than the other exemptions provided in the different sections of the rule for a solid waste handling facility. We made a few changes to this section, mostly to provide clarity, to address some misconceptions about where the BUD program should be used. So one of the things we did was change the definition of beneficial use to limit it to only activities approved under the BUD program in that section of the rule, or under the land application section of the rule that comes with permitting for certain beneficial uses of materials on the land. And we provided clarity that the BUD program is not a means to avoid permit or notice of exemption for solid waste facilities. So the beneficial use program really is meant to capture only use of a material. So any upfront processing, for example, at a solid waste facility would be subject to the other standards in the rule. So this is not to exempt or exclude a facility handling activity from meeting the other requirements. We provided clarity that the beneficial use section is not for alternative daily cover materials at landfills. So there are other landfill rules that talk about approval processes for alternative daily cover materials that health departments have oversight for. So this program is not for that. And we wanted to clarify too that beneficial use does not include use as fill, except under very specific circumstances where you have a material that actually meets an engineering spec that is confirmed by a professional engineer who says they need that specification at a site. Another change we made was just to require proof that a material provides the benefit claimed. We do allow the approval of some intermediate storage under this section of the rule that we didn't previously have. So if you had a beneficial use exemption, the upfront storage didn't necessarily get kicked out of having to meet other standards in the rule. Now we have an approval process under the BUD program in order to evaluate those. So you wouldn't necessarily get tied to a permit necessarily in all cases for intermediate storage. For things to be used as soil amendments, we require more detail on nutrients, pathogens, any contaminants in your material that might be a concern. And then the Washington State Department of Agriculture revised our overriding statute, or got revisions to it, I'm sorry, a few years ago, in regards to the movement of pests across the state. And so they get review authority now for any beneficial use determination applications. All health departments in the state already review the applications that come through because it is a statewide exemption, and now the Department of Ag gets to review them too. I'm going to go right in to changes then to our land application section. So if you can go to the next slide. And the next slide. Thank you. So for the permitted land application sites, we didn't have any substantial changes at all to the permitted sites. If you are looking at the rule, you'll see changes, but it's really just organizational stuff. So no substantial changes at all to permitting, to the permitted sections of land application sites. And we don't offer any conditional exemptions in the rule for land application, but as part of the revisions to this section of the rule, it did result in changes to the applicability section. We have, as a result of conversations in the land application section, we've expanded the exclusion we have from the rule for the agronomic application of manure and crop residue. We had a previous limitation for it to be just limited to manure and crop residue. We have now added bedding to that exclusion, which makes sense. It was always kind of part of the package, but wasn't specifically listed. And then we added a new term and exclusion for on-farm vegetative waste. So this is a plant-based material produced on a farm, and you're going to be reusing it back on the farm. So it's not necessarily manure or crop residue or bedding, but it's things like, spoiled feed, or some other examples, mint waste from the extraction of mint oil at the farm growing the mint. So there are portable distillers that go around from field to field oftentimes, And the mint itself never leaves the farm, and then it gets land applied back on that farm. So we wanted to be able to offer an exclusion from the rule for that to be, kicked in under a permitted solid waste handling activity. And then likewise, we have a growing wine industry in the state, and a lot of those folks, they produce the grapes or they grow the grapes and they process them into wine, and then they put the grape hummus right back on their orchard or their vineyard. And we wanted to allow that activity without kicking them under some permit scenario. And then we have altered the definition of manure and bedding. One of the comments we had during a public comment period was, what about wash water from the cleanup of manure and bedding? And apparently there were questions about wash water in regards to some other activities like anaerobic digestion at some point. So we wanted to make sure that even if you had a mixture of wash water and manure and bedding, that all of that could be captured under this exclusion from the rule when your land applying at agronomic rates. And then we did clarify that manure is meant to be from livestock animals, or in the case of the Woodland Park Zoo animal manure is also captured as manure. One of the reasons we tied it specifically to livestock is because the exclusion is really for agricultural activities. And if you're managing something like, you have a dog food pickup facility or something along those lines, you're likely not calculating an agronomic rate and growing that on a field. And so we simply wanted to acknowledge it's for livestock manure only. And then we had this weird limitation to manure being only from herbivorous animals before. So those are animals that eat only plants. And, chickens eat insects, plenty of other things eat, non-plant material. And so we just simply removed that restriction to it being from herbivorous animals. And then we did alter the definition of crop residue, and it's to acknowledge, existing policy. We don't think that unprocessed produce from storage facilities, we think it can be managed as crop residue as well. It often goes back on fields for agronomic value, and we wanted to make sure that wouldn't be captured under a permit scenario.
So we had a question, if you could briefly go over the new exemptions to the beneficial use permit exemptions again.
There aren't any new exemptions to that section. We've just simply provided clarity on how that program should work. So the entire section allows a statewide exemption from having to, for whatever beneficial use of solid waste goes through the application and review process there. So the entire section offers a random sort of exemption process if you have a beneficial use for a solid waste material that's not otherwise excluded elsewhere in the rule. So there's no specific categories.
Okay, and then we have a question from Dan Burgard.
Okay, I got a question about the crop residue.
Okay.
Now that was the revised definition to include produce from storage, unprocessed produce from storage. Would that be like tear dirt and vines and potatoes, things like that?
Well, it's usually, the potatoes go into a storage shed, and at some point those potatoes aren't sold anymore, or they go bad and they go back out on a field without having been processed at all. It's for things like that.
Okay, but it wouldn't include the vines and material that shakes off of the potatoes, the culls and things like that would
not as a food processor. The definition of crop residue, includes vegetative material left, during the harvest of plants on the field. So the leaves and stuff that get knocked off in actually harvesting of something like potatoes. But once it goes to a food processor, that's no longer crop residue.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
Food processing facilities are considered industrial waste. We don't like that term, but we're kind of stuck with that. And those aren't considered crop residue. Once it leaves the farm or something, happens to it in the processing business, it changes.
Okay, and so the crop residues then, excluding anything from a vegetable processing plant, would be excluded from the solid waste rules. Is that correct?
No. Food processing materials are captured in the rule. There might be exemptions in other sections. Oh. No. I mean, if it's not from a food processor, if it's just from an agricultural storage. If it's just from storage back out onto the field at an agronomic rate, I think that, depending on what you're talking about, like, it's unprocessed produce from cold store, or from storage facilities is the specific language.
Okay, then that doesn't require a permit. That has an exemption, is that correct?
It's excluded from the rule when applied at agronomic rate, correct?
So we have a follow-up question to the bud exemption.
Okay,
Says, I'm curious about the new exemptions in WAC 173, 350, 200, 1B that relate to material used as fill and material used for daily cover. Are these materials considered beneficial use?
no. So what I mentioned there was we provided clarity that the bud section will not apply to alternative daily cover because those are approved under the landfill permits for the facilities receiving alternative daily cover. So there is no beneficial use that will be allowed for alternative daily cover proposals. And likewise for anything used as fill except in very limited circumstances where you have met an engineering spec that a professional engineer has called for.